Yeah.
The reason we got onto this was because one of the manuscripts says that Percival, who is Galahad, who I say was a galley priest, was the nephew of Joseph of Arimathea.
Right.
And that's a problem for Arthurian legend, of course, because we're going back again to the 1st century. And therefore, Percival was a 1st century knight in Judea. He was a nephew of Joseph of Arimathea. And the donkey that was owned by the first of the Fisher Kings was the same donkey that was owned by Joseph of Arimathea. Again, we're going back to the 1st century. And the confusion between some of these is with the galleys, which, as you said, has been translated as Wales, because Wales was called Galles in that early era. That was its name in Norman French. It was known as the Galles. But the Galles was also a very famous sect, religious sect in Syria and Judea in the 1st century. And they were known as the Galileans. Famous name, because remember, Saul and Jesus were both known as Galileans. But they were also this 1st century sect. And we have there were various people who wrote histories of the sects of this region. By Christians, they were condemning these sects, but by condemning them, they gave us some information about these various sects from the 1st century. And so we have this history. And we have this history of the galleys. And the galleys were eunuchs. And this was fairly common in the East at this time. So we have this story from Lucian of the galley ceremony or celebration. He says, on these days the galley are made. When the rest are playing flutes and performing rites, a frenzy comes upon many, and he throws off his clothes and rushes to the center with a great shout and takes up a sword and immediately castrates himself. And then the galley runs through the city holding his testicles in his hands, and he takes female clothing from whoever's window he throws the testicles through. So these were known as the testicle tossers. And they were the galley.
Crazy days.
Crazy days, but Jesus did the same. And of course, this is not preached from the pulpit because they won't tell you this. But it says in Matthew 19:11, there are some eunuchs which were born from their, this is Jesus speaking to his disciples. There are some eunuchs which were born from their mother's womb, and there are some eunuchs which were made eunuchs by men. And there are some eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He that can receive it, let him receive it. So this is a call from Jesus to his disciples that if they are able to castrate themselves, they should do so. Now that might sound odd if you don't know about the history of the galley, but what he is saying is, if you want to become a galley high priest or even a galley priest, you must castrate yourself. And this is Jesus talking to his disciples. And of course, Jesus was a Galilean. And therefore he was a galley himself, probably. He was probably castrated later in life because he had several children. But there was no problem of you getting castrated later in life when you joined the priesthood. And of course, that's something that the Christian priesthood will not tell you about today, that it is quite likely that Jesus was a eunuch.
Would they even be aware of it?
Well, yes, because they dressed in women's clothing. So we have this from Lucian, and we have this from Josephus. So Josephus Flavius, who's supposed to be a fairly reliable historian of the 1st century, And he gives us a description of the Galileans. And remember that Jesus and Saul were both, and Peter were both all called Galileans. And Josephus says of them, he says, these Galileans indulged themselves in feminine wantonness. They decked their hair and put on women's garments, and they were smeared with ointments that they may appear very comely. They had paints under their eyes and imitated not only the ornaments, but also the lusts of women. But while their faces looked like the faces of women, they killed with their right hands, and while their gait was effeminate, they attacked men and became warriors, and they drew their swords from under their finely decked dresses and ran everybody through that they alighted upon. So they were warriors, but in dresses. And you might think, well, that's a bit strange. That could never happen. That's, outside my experience. But have a look at a bishop or a cardinal today.
I was just thinking that, yeah.
What do they wear? They wear women's dresses. Because that is the tradition. And a red dress as well, because Sir Galahad probably wore a red dress. And that's what they wear today, is a red dress. Bishops and cardinals. And, we all think it fairly normal as they, line up and go into the Vatican or whatever. But they're a load of priests wearing women's dresses. And so the same tradition still is with us even today. And it comes from these roots, but nobody will talk about it. So they are the Galli. And what I was saying in my Arthurian legend is that Arthurian legend is following the same tradition in that Sir Percival was given the title of Galahad. He became a Galli because Percival castrated himself in Arthurian legend. It specifically says this. And we end up in Arthurian legend with this line of Fisher Kings, who were also the wounded kings. And they were specifically wounded between the thighs. So it's pretty obvious that the wounded king in Arthurian legend was a eunuch. Why? Because he was a Galli. He was a Galilean. And it links up with this Arthurian story and the first century of Judea and the gospel story. It all starts to link up. And remember that in Arthurian legend, we start with the first of the Fisher Kings. Now, who was the first Fisher King? It was Jesus. He was the fisher of men. And he was a king. He was the first of the Fisher Kings. This goes back to procession, which we were talking about before. So the procession of the equinox, where we have the great months that change every 2,000 years or so. So in the first century, we went from Aries into Pisces. And therefore, Jesus was born as a Lamb of God, but became a fisher of men. He was anointed with this title according to the procession of the equinox. And he became the first of the Fisher Kings. And of course, in Arthurian legend, we end up with this line of Fisher Kings, who are the first kings of Pisces, because they're following the procession of the equinox. And of course, the father of King Arthur was a Fisher King. And we know this because if you look at the father of Arthur was called Pendragon, Uther Pendragon. I think, everybody knows that famous name. Except that's not what he was called. And I was pretty amazed when I saw this, because if you look in any English translation, of course, he's called Uther Pendragon. But if you go back into the early manuscripts written in both Welsh and in Latin, he's not called Pendragon. He is called Ben Dragon.
Son of.
Son of. But only son of if you realize that these texts were written in Aramaic, not in Welsh. And that's why they refuse to translate it, because they're trying to translate it from Welsh, so it has to be pen something. And it's not, it's Ben. It's written as Ben, and two words, not Ben Dragon. It's two separate words, Ben Dragon. Ben obviously is Aramaic, as you say, meaning son of. Dragon means fish in Aramaic. He's the son of the fish. He is a fisher king. And so Ben Dragon, the father of King Arthur, was a fisher king. It's saying so, but only if you understand it's written in Aramaic. And of course, I understood it was written in Aramaic because if any of these researchers had bothered to read the Vulgate Cycle, which is, I say, this enormous great corpus of Arthurian legend, all the way through, it's saying that this inscription was written in the Chaldean. So it's actually saying in the actual manuscripts, the actual Arthurian legend itself, that the names that were given to, you know, various ships and swords, and they kept coming across things written, you know, magical names written on things. They're all written in Chaldean, Aramaic. Why? Well, because this story came back from the Crusades. This is a crusading story. This is why the statues of Arthur are all in Italy, all to do with the Normans, all to do with the end of the crusade, not at the end, the beginning of the Crusades. And where were they during the Crusades? They were in the Near East. They were in Syria. They were in Judea. And what do they speak there? They speak Chaldean, Aramaic. Excalibur is normally called Caliburn, and Caliburn in Aramaic means sword. It's just saying what it is. It's a Caliburn, you know. And so you can start to see where the origins of this story came from, and suddenly you can see that Pendragon was not Pendragon at all. He was Ben Dragon. He was the son of the fish, the first of the fisher kings. And we know this as well because this all links up. I don't like just translating a name as some other researchers do, and they say, oh, Ben Dragon sounds like Pendragon, therefore that must be the same person. Yeah, that's not good enough. Okay, we have the similarity in the name, we have the line of the fisher kings, and then we have the birth of King Arthur. And King Arthur, it's not a premonition. The symbol of his birth is a comet in the sky, a comet with two rays, and they signified the birth of Arthur and the birth of Guinevere, his sister. Again, sister wife, same as we've seen before. Guinevere was his sister. So we have this comet with two rays, which signified the birth of Arthur. And if you look up at the sky in the beginning of the 1st century, what is the comet with two rays?
It's the Great Bear, isn't it?
No, it's Pisces.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
Pisces has two arms. And on the end of each arm is a fish. So you have two fishes and two rays. That's what it's describing. More than that, if you go to Dendera in Egypt and have a look at the Dendera Zodiac, you will see that Pisces, because that's exactly as, you know, they portrayed it in the same fashion as we do today, you know, 2,000 years later, 2,300 years later. On the Dendera Zodiac, those fishes, so the two arms, the two rays of Pisces, end up in two fishes at the end, but each one is notated with a circle. One is for Isis, the other one is for Horus. One is for the daughter, for the mother in this case, one is for the son, male and female. It's exactly as was narrated by William of not Malmesbury, I'm forgetting his name now. Exactly as narrated in Arthurian Legend by Geoffrey of Monmouth is exactly what he says. It's almost as if Geoffrey of Monmouth is looking at the Dendera Zodiac and describing what he sees, the two rays that signify the female and the male. Okay, he says brother and sister, but on the Dendera zodiac, it's the mother and the son, Isis and Horus. It's exactly the same. He's describing the Dendera zodiac. And so again, we have Arthurian legend coming out of something to do with the zodiac, something that is Egyptian, and also closely connected to Pisces, the Fisher Kings. So we have the name and the symbolism and the location all pointing at Pisces and the Fisher Kings. That's why I think his name was Ben Dragon, the son of the fish. So we're almost ready to make an identification of who this Arthurian character is. So we have this story that comes out of the Near East. A lot of it is to do with the first century. A lot of the characters are all first century characters. Joseph of Arimathea, for starters, and a lot of the other ones who are identified with the first century. And what was this story about in that case? Well, it came out of the Crusades. And so I say it came out of the Near East. And we know this because of, things like Wolfram von Eschenbach in his Parsifal. Parsifal starts Arthurian legend exactly where you think it may well start, in Mesopotamia. So his story starts in Mesopotamia with the father of Percival being a knight working for King Baruch in Mesopotamia. Yeah, what's that got to do with Arthurian legend? Anyway, eventually in this story, he eventually ends up in Galles, in Wales. But the whole story starts in Mesopotamia. So in my estimation, the whole of this story came back from the Crusades, which is where these people were, the Norman knights were in the early 12th century. And the other strange thing is, before we get there, is where did these crusades go to? So these Norman knights, they were led by Count Baldwin of Boulogne in 1096. This was on the Prince's Crusade. We're not talking about the People's Crusade, which failed, of course. But the Prince's Crusade in 1096, the first crusade it's normally called, was led by Count Baldwin of Boulogne, who would have been a Norman, of course. And they went across Anatolia, and they got to Antioch, which is on the north, sort of eastern point of the Mediterranean. And they didn't turn right. So Jerusalem is obviously to the south. You're supposed to turn right and go down to Jerusalem, because that's why you're there, is to save Jerusalem from Islam. But they didn't. They carried straight on. They went across the Euphrates. They went into Mesopotamia. And the first city to be liberated from Muslim control was Edessa. The very city that I've been talking about in my book, Jesus, King of Edessa, a city which I didn't even know when I started that book, let alone know it was mentioned in Arthurian legend. I had no idea at the time.
This is modern day Sanliurfa in Turkey?
Sanliurfa, yeah, in modern Turkey, Anatolia. And it was the first Christian city, of course, because it was linked to Jesus as the King of Edessa, hence the title of my book. I say that he was a prince and a king who came from Edessa. But then the Crusades come along 1,000 years later. And where do they go to? The first city they go to is Edessa. Isn't that a bit peculiar? And remember, I had no idea about this when I wrote my book on that topic. And then I find that Baldwin of Boulogne goes straight to Edessa. Why go to Edessa? Why not go to Jerusalem? Why not go to any of the other famous cities down in Judea? Nope. First city he goes to was Edessa. And the reason I think he went there is because he understood through tradition and probably through his family that there were secrets to be had in Edessa. And they found the secrets. And then, of course, they went down to Jerusalem and took Jerusalem as well. And it wasn't him, there was another Baldwin who became the king of Jerusalem about 10, 20 years later. And then they sent up the Knights Templar in 1119, was it? I forget when they set them up. 1119. They set up the Templars, and they were officially ratified, I think, in about 1130. They set up the Knights Templar. And the Knights Templar held secrets. That's why they were feared. So what were the secrets that the Knights Templar held that made them so powerful, that made them so popular, that people would want to join the Knights Templar? Because to join the Knights Templar, you had to give up all of your worldly belongings. All of your property, all of your wealth had to go to the organization, to the order. And you became a poor knight of Christ because you had no more money. You had given all your money to the order. You became a poor knight of Christ. It was like you were joining a kibbutz, basically. Same idea. It was as if you were joining the Nazarene Church of Jesus and James, who were called the Ebionites, the poor knights of Christ. Their church, the Church of Jesus, had the same name as the Templars. So Jesus was the head of the Templars in the 1st century. And like the Templars, when you joined the Church of Jesus and James, you had to give up all your belongings and all your wealth to the order in exactly the same fashion. And we know this because we have the story of Ananias and Sophia in Acts of the Apostles. So this is in the Gospels themselves. And they were told to give up all of their wealth. And they didn't. They kept a property aside. And so they were confronted by St. Peter, who said, why did you keep this property? You were supposed to give all of your property to the Church of Jesus and James. And they had no good excuse. So St. Peter murdered them both.
Wow.
This is in Acts of the Apostles. Again, it's not something that's preached from the pulpit. They're not going to tell you that one. But yes, they had exactly the same policy as the Knights Templar. And if you disobeyed them, you were killed by St. Peter. And so we have this direct analogy between these two. Oh, and the other similarity as well is the community rule of the Knights Templar is the same as the community rule of the Essene, that monastic sort of sect that was on the shores of the Dead Sea, down in Qumran. We have their community rule because it was found. In fact, well, it was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, of course. But when they picked it out of the Dead Sea Scrolls, they thought, "Wow, this is familiar. Seen this before somewhere." And it had been found 200 years earlier in a synagogue in Cairo. And the synagogue in Cairo had preserved this same text for nearly 2,000 years in this synagogue, and they had the full copy of the Essene community rule.
Wow.
Anyway, it's exactly the same as the community rule of the Knights Templar. Again, the one was descended from the other. So we have this new monastic sect of the Knights Templar that was firmly based upon what was going on in the 1st century in Judea. And they were greatly feared by the Catholic Church because they held secrets. So what was that secret? The secret was Arthurian legend. So Arthurian legend came from the Knights Templar. That's why it appeared in Europe 5 years after the Knights Templar were firmly established in 1130. 5 years later, after the Knights Templar were established, Arthurian legend comes out.
And this is why it's being much more widely reported by the likes of Geoffrey of Monmouth and was it what's his name, Oxford?
Yeah, because
in the sort of 11th, 12th century.
Yeah, they were given it because they were obviously scribes, they were authors, they could craft this into a story. Wolfram von Eschenbach wrote it because he was a Knights Templar, as he sort of says in his manuscript. He was linked to the Templars. They were told to go off and write this story. Here's the information, go off and write this story. Because the story that they'd come back with from the Crusades was a secular gospel of the biblical Jesus. It was my book, Jesus, King of Edessa. That's what they found. They found my book, Jesus, King of Edessa, in Edessa in the 12th century. And they didn't know what to do with it because it was heretical. You tell this story, you read my book, King of Edessa, in the 12th century, and you're going to get burnt at the stake. Even if you're, a part of the Knights Templar, which was a fairly powerful sort of organization. And you wanted to spread this information around. You didn't want everyone being burnt at the stake because they had this manuscript. So what could you do with it? I mean, the secular story of Jesus is saying that Jesus was a real king. He was a king of Edessa, and he led the Jewish revolt. That's what my book, Jesus, King of Edessa, is about. You could not tell that story in the 12th century. It was simply not possible. So what are you going to do with it? Well, you can change the guy's name to Arthur, and you can set it in Dark Age Britain, because no one knows what the hell happened in Dark Age Britain anyway, because there is no history. And it would actually be nice if you could pair it up with a nation who had led a revolt against Rome, because that's what this guy was doing. And so you have a sort of similar history, and you can tack it onto that history, because the story of Arthur has been tacked on to the history of Constantine III within Arthurian, within the manuscripts of Walter and Oxford, Monmouth and Oxford. It's been tacked on to the history of Constantine III. And people probably won't know this history either, because unless you've delved into Arthurian history, it's not obvious. Constantine III was a British emperor. So he was, the Romans had left pretty much, the Romans had left in about 405 AD from Britain. The islands were undefended, and so the British elected their own king, who was called Constantine, and he called himself Constantine III, the new emperor. And so he actually tried to become the emperor of Rome. So he gathered an army and trotted off down through France and into Spain, and he became the emperor, a usurper emperor, of course, for about 3 or 4 years. And so he had done more or less the same as what the Arthurian character had done and what the Jesus character had done. And so it was very easy to tack his story onto the end of his reign. And so what Monmouth and Oxford have done is they've tacked Arthur on as a grandson of Constantine III, as a British emperor. And that's where, but of course, there's no evidence whatsoever in the historical record that Constantine had this extra grandson called King Arthur. It's just not there in the historical record. It's just been tacked on. And of course, there is no possibility that any grandson of Constantine III was fighting the Romans in Britain or whatever. There were no Romans at that time. I mean, some of these people put it up to as much as the 520s AD. Well, there were no Romans left in Europe at that time. The whole of the Western Empire had gone in about 480. And only the Eastern Empire remained. So it doesn't tie up with British history, but it does tie up with all of Eastern history, first century history. And that's why we get these odd manuscripts, including the Vulgate Cycle, saying that Arthurian Legend was written by Josephus Flavius in the first century. That's why, because it was a secular gospel, and nobody knew what to do with this secular gospel because it was so heretical. But if you dress it up as Arthurian Legend, you can tell that story, no problem at all. It's the same as Rapunzel. No one's going to burn you at the stake for reciting the poem about, or the children's fairy story about Rapunzel. But Rapunzel is Mary Magdalene, the princess of the tower. Again, you're not going to be able to, you're going to be able to dress up that story, and you can tell it with impunity because you've changed the story. Same with Cinderella. Cinderella is Mary Magdalene again. The girl with the black face, the Black Madonnas. She was, known as Cinders, looking for her lost prince. She's always looking for her lost prince, who was Jesus, of course. All of these, a lot of these fairy stories come back to this same old story. Snow White is a copy of the movement of the moon. So Snow White is the moon, followed by her 7 planets, her 7 smaller dwarf planets as they go around the ecliptic. And then the wicked witch puts a corset on her and draws it tighter and tighter, so she gets thinner and thinner, just as the moon gets thinner and thinner as it proceeds towards the new moon. And then the moon dies. It goes black. You can't see it anymore. It dies. But at that time, the moon is kissed by a prince. Snow White is kissed by a prince. And that can only happen during the new moon. It's an eclipse, of course, when the moon kisses the sun.
Yeah.
And that's an eclipse. And then she comes back to life again. It's a lot of these stories have hidden meanings, and Arthurian Legend is no different. It has a hidden meaning, and it was made for a purpose because it was heretical. It was the only way you could tell this story. More than tell the story, you could laugh at the Catholic Church because they had no idea what you were laughing about. You could tell this story about King Arthur and laugh at the priesthood, and they would have no idea what you're talking about. And that's why that's why it became so popular. It was everyone just laughing at the Catholic Church because they knew, but you would only know if you were illuminated, if someone had told you what this story was about. And as soon as they tell you, then the whole thing becomes obvious. You've only got to have one little prompt and the whole thing becomes obvious. But you can deny it, of course. No, it's nothing to do with that. No. Nothing to do with the first century. Dark Age king, different country. And that's where Arthurian Legend came from. Now, that's a very different tale to what is normally given. And a lot of people are so invested in the normal story that they will not accept it. They will not see the contradictions within Arthurian legend. I mean, things like the birth of King Arthur is the same as the birth of Hercules. It's identical. It shows you that this is, a story of the cosmos as well, the precession of the equinox in Pisces. But it's become so ingrained over here as a story of Great Britain that this whole tradition has grown up around it. And so people cannot accept that it was actually written for a different reason. And so, you're not going to see any of this if you just read, a casual book on King Arthur or watch one of the films or the TV series or something. Because all they do is they pick one or two simple ideas out of Geoffrey of Monmouth, and that's about it. They've never read the Vulgate Cycle and all the complexities of that story. I mean, for instance, the Vulgate Cycle in History of the Holy Grail gives the whole history of Pompey the Great. Pompey the Great, 1st century BC, Roman, well, you can call him an emperor. He wasn't really emperor. Emperor of Rome. And his whole history is given in Arthurian legend. What's that? It was a very interesting history, actually, because it was the hidden history of Pompey the Great, that he instructed his workers. He obviously had scribes working for him who kept his diary. He instructed them never to tell this story and to keep it secret even after his death. But Arthurian legend knows about it. And it gives the hidden history of the floating islands of the Mediterranean. Now, they come out of Greek history. They go back a long, long way. They go back to the eruption of Santorini in the 17th century BC. But Arthurian legend knows all about it. And we get the story of the floating islands. So, lots of interesting stuff in this story. And it's been hidden. Because obviously the Templars knew all about this. The Crusaders and the Templars would have known all about this. But it's probably been hidden ever since the Knights Templar were dissolved and destroyed on Friday the 13th of October, 1307, which is why Friday the 13th is still unlucky for some, even today, because it was the day that the Knights Templar were captured and destroyed in 1307. And at that point, I suppose, a lot of this history got extinguished. People forgot what the story was all about, because if you read Thomas Mallory, I think it's pretty obvious that he had no idea what the story was about. He just wrote it as Arthurian legend. He had no idea what the underlying story was all about. It's, in terms of looking at the history of Arthur, it's the worst of all the manuscripts. It's the latest. It's quite a young manuscript, but it's the worst because he doesn't seem to understand the story at all. Whereas quite a lot of the other ones have a lot of hidden history within them. So that is the history of Arthur.
Wow. Well, my head is spinning after all that. As I've said, I'm only sort of 150 pages into the Grail cipher, and already there's so much history that's been covered. I can't wait to read the rest of it. It's so well written and well researched.
It's detailed, isn't it?
Yeah, just out of interest, after I've read this, where would be a good place to start researching this for myself? After you've just mentioned that the Vulgate Cycle is like 5,000 pages long.
Yes.
I'm not too sure that I can handle that.
Don't touch the Vulgate Cycle. No, and it's hugely expensive. I mean, if you buy the hardback version, I think it's about £1,000. No, it's probably a bit more than that. It's probably about £1,200. You don't want to buy that one.
No, not really. That's a bit out of my budget. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a bit out of my budget as well. But anyway, such things have to go on. No, the best thing is Merlin and the Grail.
Right.
So it's written by the same guy,
Yeah.
and it's almost like a summary of the Vulgate Cycle, of the interesting bits in the Vulgate Cycle.
Okay, that's Robert de Boron.
Yeah, and it's only, I don't know, 150 pages or something, so it's quite short, easily available on the net, and it gives you a good understanding of the complexities of Arthurian legend. And it goes into the Holy Grail quite a lot, and the Grail Keeper, and how the Grail was transferred between high priest to high priest, and all of that sort of business. And even from his story, it's quite obvious that the new keeper of the Grail was Josephus Flavius. So he has that sort of heresy in it. And the Grail itself is an interesting story, because, well, here's some more links with the gospel story. The Round Table was based upon the Last Supper table. So the Last Supper table was a round table, not an oblong one.
Oh, okay. That's different to the Da Vinci painting then, isn't it?
Yes. So he painted it incorrectly. He obviously didn't know this history. But from Arthurian legend, there were 3 tables. There was the Last Supper table of Jesus and his 12 knights. Sorry, his 12 disciples. The Round Table of Joseph of Arimathea, who had 12 or 24 disciples around his round table. And then the Round Table of King Arthur with his 12 knights. And of course, Arthur and his 12 knights is the same as Jesus and his 12 disciple knights, because remember, the disciples were armed with swords anyway. And in my story, that they were, a king and his knights anyway, because Jesus was a king. And they sat around this round table. And this round table, of course, wasn't a table. It was a zodiac. And so the Jesus character, the Arthur character, should be sitting in the middle of the table. So the table would have been hollow. It had a hole in the middle of it. And the king and queen sit in the center of the table. And the 12 knights, disciples around the outside are the 12 constellations. It is a zodiac. And this might have been a real zodiac, because we have that magnificent Nazarene Jewish zodiac on the shores of the Sea of Galilee.
That's the one owned by Jesus of Gamala, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. At Hamat Tavera.
Yeah.
And so they could have, it's quite large. It's about 5 meters across. So they could have actually sat around that zodiac, because they tended to sit on cushions anyway. They didn't have tables and chairs like we do today. A lot of people sat on cushions, as they do in the East today. If you go out for a meal today, they'll have a carpet and you all sit on cushions around the outside. So I think that zodiac was probably used as a table. And you bring up your cushion, and, Sir Galahad would sit on one particular sign of the zodiac. He had, he was allocated one side of the zodiac, and they all sat around this table, and Jesus and Mary would have been sitting in the center as Helios and Selene, the moon. And that was not only a good way of feasting, but you could teach your disciple knights the procession of the equinox, which was the whole reason that this battle against the Romans took place, because he was the first of the kings of Pisces, the first of the fisher kings. That gave him his authority. And so they were sitting around this zodiac. And we have an even better version of this later on, the 6th century Lady Mary zodiac, which is just on the south end of the Sea of Galilee at Bet Shean. It wasn't open when I was there. They were just digging it out at the time. And you can't find very many photos of it. But anyway, it was in a Christian cathedral. So this is no longer Judaic, because obviously this is after the Jewish revolt. Most of the Jews have been thrown out of Judea. This was now a Christian cathedral, and they built a calendrical mosaic. So it's exactly the same as the Zodiac at Hamet Tavera, except now, instead of constellations, it's months. But of course, the months are constellations. They go around the skies together. And they're marked, from January round to October and December. In Greek this time, because the other one's in Aramaic, but this one's in Greek. But in the center, you have Helios and Selene, the cosmic couple together in the center of the Zodiac, Jesus and Mary sitting together in the center of the Zodiac. So it's pretty obvious that that's how it would have been arranged. You'd have had Jesus and Mary in the center, and then the disciple knights all sitting around the outside. And that would be the Last Supper table, because that's what Arthurian legend says.
Wow, that's incredible. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Ralph. Hopefully I'll dream of that rather than the eunuchs chopping their what's off and throwing them about in Galilee.
Yeah, we're lucky we don't have testicle tossers anymore. So
yes, thank goodness for that.
You wouldn't want that arriving through your window, would you?
Definitely not, no. Am I allowed to mention your new book?
Oh, yes, because it's coming out in about a week's time, I think. I've actually just sent it off for publication now. It takes a while to process. So I've been busy on the internet, playing around on Facebook and having Q&As with people and so on. And I thought I'd put this all together as a book, because it's quite interesting. It goes through all of the topics that people have been asking me about, whether that's to do with the Gospels, the Old Testament, climate, because I'm not sure if your listeners will know that I'm also a climate scientist. So I've written a very influential paper on climatology, on paleoclimatology, climate of the past, which again was very heretical, because it said that CO2 had nothing to do with it. So my paper proves that CO2 is not the primary feedback agent that's controlling temperature. And so the establishment didn't like that. So I got a lot of pushback against that. But I got it published. So. Yeah, very heretical. I'm always heretical. I got it published. Well, again, I came across this. We won't go into this in very much detail. We might have a talk about it later. But I came across this lacuna in science, like in the Gospels and like the Old Testament, where nobody knew why ice ages occurred. And we're in the 21st century here, And of course, in climatology, the science is settled, didn't you know? And yet nobody knew how ice ages worked. And I thought, well, this is stupid. Surely there has to be a reason why these cycles happen as they do. And I discovered the reason. So I'm the first person to have discovered the reason of why we have the ice age cycle.
Wow. And I would love to have you back on to discuss that.
We could have a go at that. And everyone has shouted and screamed about it, but they've not managed to refute it. So I think that's very encouraging. Anyway, so I write about that as well, and a little bit about COVID, because I got hacked off with COVID. And so there's one or two discussions about that in this book. I mean, I think there's 360 topics in this book. So I go through a lot of topics. There's 600 pages in it. Again, it's another fairly large book. Anyway, the book is due out at the end of this week, maybe early next week. It depends how Amazon gets on with their production system, because there's always problems with production. The paperback will be out first, and that will be followed later by the ebook, because I've not had the content back from the ebook. I don't fully do the ebooks myself. I get them translated, because it's a very complicated process of turning it from a book into an ebook. So I get a company to do that for me. But guaranteed when it comes back, it won't be correct. So I'll be sitting there doing amendments and adjustments to that for a week at least. So ebook maybe at the end of the month. Hopefully that will come out.
And just so everyone's aware, it's called Shards of Illumination.
Shards of Illumination, yes. Illumination, because I'm trying to resurrect or to rehabilitate is the better word. Rehabilitate the word of to illuminate, or the Illuminati. The Illuminati is just shedding light on a forbidden topic. And that's what the Illuminati were always doing. And traditionally, of course, these were things that were forbidden by the Catholic Church, and they threw illumination on these forbidden topics. And that's why we had the Enlightenment, because they became illuminated. That's what it was all about.
Well, that's very interesting, because, I mean, present day, most people would kind of think of the word Illuminati as being something very evil and devious, controlling, etc.
It's quite the opposite. It was the fundamental foundation of the Enlightenment was the illumination. And yes, of course, people fear them because, you know, nobody likes a controlling authority, but this was a hidden controlling authority that was trying to undermine the persecution of the Catholic Church and give us sufficient enlightenment that we could have the Industrial Revolution. All of that came about because of the Illuminati shedding light on the hidden topics that the scientific topics that you were not allowed to discuss. And so people like Galileo would have been an Illuminati, whether he considered himself or not. He would have been an honorary Illuminati because he was shedding light on what the Catholic Church didn't want you to know about. And that was the foundation for all of the works of, you know, Michelangelo and Leonardo, and going through into the Industrial Revolution. It was investigating those aspects of nature that you weren't allowed to do so under the Catholic Church. And so I've named it the Shards of Illumination, because I've got shards of glass that can come, and they can, well, I dare say that they can cut and wound if you're not careful, as the illumination comes through, if you stand in their way. So I've got shards of illumination, little slivers.
Wow, can't wait to read that, Ralph. Another subject you've broached many times is Shakespeare.
Yes, I write about that in my Shards of Illumination. Yeah, I found that interesting. Again, we don't have time to go through it. But
I was going to ask you if we could do a separate video on Shakespeare.
Yeah, we could do that along with the climate, maybe, because the climate won't take too long to discuss, and then we could tack that on the end of it. But just as a reason why I got interested in this is it's another lacuna. It's another hole in our understanding. And it has great relevance to the gospel story, because here we may well have lost a very important character from history within the last 500 years. Because there are many reasons to think that the guy who we think was Shakespeare was not Shakespeare. And if you can lose someone as important as Shakespeare within the last 500 years, well, then think of how you could lose a character like Arthur or a character like Jesus in the last 2,000 years.
Exactly.
And I do think we have misidentified the Shakespearean character. And this is not my invention. This comes back from a lot of people have been working on this. It first came from Thomas Looney, who wrote about it in the 1920s. And it's been taken up more recently. It sort of died a death after he mentioned this. And then it's been resurrected again in the 80s, 90s by a raft of characters who investigated this in great depth and have virtually proved Thomas Looney to be correct, that his identification was correct. And we've been looking for all of this time at the wrong guy for the Shakespearean character. Yeah, it's an interesting little story.
Fantastic. Okay, well, hopefully we can have you on again very soon to discuss that and climate science and your new book. Fantastic, Ralph.
Shards of Illumination.
Shards of Illumination, yeah. Thank you so much for coming on with me today. Really, really grateful. It's so interesting, this information. Big thank you, Ralph. Cheers.
Pleasure. See you again later.
See you again. Cheers, mate.